Heat sat on the Georgia backroad like a hand pressing down, thick enough to bend the air over the gravel into something you could almost see moving. Deborah Arnold didn't stop walking. The mattress was strapped across her shoulders with rope that had cut a permanent groove into her skin months ago, and there was still most of a mile left before the farmhouse came into view. She had promised herself a long time back that stopping halfway was its own kind of surrender, and Deborah Arnold did not surrender. Beside her, 4-year-old Naomi dragged 2 grocery bags through the red dirt, her braids damp at the temples, glancing up at her mother every few steps the way small children do, when they're too young to ask the real question out loud, but old enough to feel it. That was the moment the black G-Wagon came around the bend, engine idling low, tires crunching to a stop that nobody inside the car remembered deciding to make. Hanal Chan's hands found the wheel and gripped it before his mind caught up to why. He was 42 years old. He had buried men. He had built shipping lanes that moved more product through Southeast Asia in a week than most companies moved in a year. And none of it, not one boardroom, not one blood debt paid in full, had ever made his hands shake the way they were shaking now, looking at a woman he hadn't seen in 26 years hauling a stranger's old mattress down a road that led nowhere important. 26 years does a lot to face. It hadn't done enough to hide this one. The tilt of her head against the sun, the exhausted set of her jaw, the walk that used to be light and was now just endurance dressed up as movement. He knew all of it, because there had been 2 years of his life when memorizing Deborah Arnold had felt like the only worthwhile thing he'd ever done. He had left her at 18 with nothing but a promise and a syndicate debt he didn't choose. Looking at her now, thinner than she should have been, dust ground into skin that used to laugh easily, one thought moved through him louder than every empire he'd ever built. It's her. God help him, it's actually her. Welcome back, family. If this is your first time riding with us, drop where you're watching from in the comments, because a story like this one deserves witnesses. Hit that subscribe button and like this video before we go any further, because what Hanal Chan does next is going to test everything he thinks power is supposed to mean. He didn't approach her. Not yet. He sat behind that windshield and watched Naomi's small hand rub absently at her own wrist. A habit. A specific and unmistakable habit that belonged to his late brother and to no one else on this earth, and something in his chest that had been armored shut for 2 decades cracked clean down the middle. Every paper trail in this county ended in a sterling vault, until today, and he didn't even know that name yet. He only knew that the woman walking toward that crumbling farmhouse was carrying more than a mattress on her back. She was carrying a secret with his blood in it, and whatever had happened to her in the 26 years since he left, it had a name, and it had a price, and somebody in this county was going to answer for it. He could command 1,000 syndicate soldiers, but he couldn't yet look his own daughter in the eye. And by the time this story is over, you're going to watch a man built on violence discover that the only war worth winning is the one you fight without a single bullet. Because when Hanal Chan finally steps out of that car and onto the red clay, he has no idea that a smiling old tycoon 2 miles down the road is about to become the most dangerous man he's ever faced. Not with a gun, but with a signature, a courtroom, and 26 years of buried lies. That's where we're headed. Stay with me. He didn't drive away. That was the thing that surprised him most, not the sight of her, but the fact that his own body refused the order his mind kept giving it. Stay where you are. Don't move. Let her pass. Hanal Chan sat behind the wheel of the G-Wagon with the engine ticking as it cooled, watching Deborah Arnold and the little girl grow smaller down the road, and he understood with a kind of quiet horror that he was not the man he'd spent 26 years convincing himself he'd become. That man would have already made a decision. That man would have already moved. Instead, he sat there like a boy again, like the 18-year-old who used to wait outside her daddy's church on Sunday mornings just to catch 5 minutes of her laugh before service started, and he let her walk away from him a second time. He gave it 10 minutes before he followed. Not close. He wasn't fool enough for that. Not yet. Not until he understood what he was looking at. He eased the car forward at a crawl, gravel popping soft under the tires, keeping enough distance that if she turned around all she'd see was a black shape shimmering in the heat, easy to mistake for nothing at all. The road bent twice more before the farmhouse came into view, and when it did, Something in Hanul Chan's chest folded in on itself. The house had been white once. He could tell that much from the paint still clinging in stubborn patches to the boards, but the roof sagged in the middle like a spine that had given up holding itself straight, and one whole corner of the porch had dropped low enough that a person would have to step over it rather than walk across it. A line of laundry hung limp in the windless heat. There was no truck in the yard, no sign of a man's boots by the door, nothing that spoke of help coming from anywhere. Deborah shifted the mattress off her shoulders at the bottom step with the particular care of a woman handling something she could not afford to damage, because damaged meant no bed, and no bed meant the floor, and Hanul Chan understood in that instant that this was not a woman between circumstances. This was a woman who had been living inside this particular kind of hard for a long, long time. He parked half a mile back, off the shoulder where a stand of pines gave him cover, and he watched through field glasses he kept in the glove box for reasons that used to have nothing to do with grief. Naomi set the grocery bags down and immediately reached to help her mother angle the mattress through the front door, 4 years old and already fluent in the language of making yourself useful. And then, in the space between one task and the next, the girl paused on the porch step, wiped sweat from her brow with the back of her hand, and rubbed her opposite wrist twice, slow, absent, unconscious, the exact gesture that Hanul Chan's brother used to make when he was thinking hard about something he didn't want to say out loud. Hanul Chan lowered the glasses. His hands were shaking again, worse than before, and for a man who had once held a gun steady on 3 separate occasions, while men twice his size begged for their lives, that shake felt like the loudest thing in the world. He did the math without wanting to. 4 years old. 26 years since he'd left for Seoul, but 4 years ago, he had come back. One time. One reckless, forbidden week when the syndicate thought he was securing a shipping contract in Savannah, and he'd instead driven 3 hours out of his way because he'd heard through an old contact that Deborah Arnold still lived in this county, still hadn't married, still walked the same roads. He told himself it was closure. He'd told himself a lot of things that week. He hadn't told himself the truth, which was that he needed to see her face one more time before the life he'd chosen swallowed him whole, and for 6 days he had let himself remember what it felt like to belong to something that wasn't a ledger or a blood debt. 6 days, and then his own people scrubbed him clean off every record in that town, because a syndicate boss with a soft spot was a liability, and liabilities got handled. Had she tried to find him? Had there been a letter, a call, anything? And had it simply vanished into whatever machinery his family used to keep his old life sealed shut? That question sat in his chest like a stone he couldn't swallow or spit out, and he didn't have an answer yet. He only had a 4-year-old girl on a broken porch, rubbing her wrist the way his brother used to, and a woman inside that house who had apparently raised her alone through every single one of those years. He did not go to the door. Every instinct in him, the old instinct, the boardroom instinct, the instinct that had built empires out of patience, told him that walking up those steps right now, in a suit that cost more than this house was probably worth, would not be an act of love. It would be an act of violence dressed up in good intentions. Deborah Arnold had survived this long without him. Showing up now with money in his hand would tell her exactly what kind of man he'd let himself become, and he wasn't ready to let that be true, not until he understood what had actually happened here, who had put her in this position, and why a woman who used to run logistics for a regional processing company was now hauling second-hand mattresses down a dirt road in 100-degree heat. He drove back into town and checked into the only motel within 20 miles, a low strip of rooms with a flickering vacancy sign, and he sat on the edge of a bed that smelled like bleach and old carpet, still in his suit, still gripping his phone like it might give him an answer if he held it long enough. 26 years of building something untouchable, and none of it, not $1, not one favor owed to him by men who ran ports and courts and police departments on 2 continents, meant a single thing sitting in this room. He had power over almost everything. He had no power at all over the look on Deborah's face if he knocked on that door tomorrow and got it wrong. Before we go further with Hanul Chan tonight, I want to ask you something, because I know exactly who's watching this with me. Women who have carried more than a mattress in their lifetime. Women who know what it costs to hold a family together with nothing but will. If Deborah's story is already sitting on your chest a little heavy, I want you to know she is not the only woman in our collection who fought her way back from being counted out. There's different stories waiting for you right now, different heroines, a different fight, discounted for a limited time as part of our founding member edition. 2 powerful novels together, with a free audiobook included so you can listen while your hands stay busy. The link is sitting in the description box and pinned right at the top of the comments below this video. And if you're watching on your TV tonight, that's no trouble at all. Just pull out your phone, open the camera, and hold it steady over the QR code that comes up on your screen. It'll take you straight there. This isn't a pause in Deborah's story, it's standing with her. Every woman who's ever been underestimated deserves to have her story bought, read, and believed. That night, Hanol Chan didn't sleep. He sat at the small motel desk with a legal pad in front of him, the kind of plain yellow pad he hadn't used in 15 years, and he wrote one name at the top, and beneath it, in handwriting that had gone unsteady for the first time in longer than he could remember, he wrote, "Find out who did this to her." He didn't yet know the name Arthur Sterling. He didn't know that the answer to that question would lead him straight back through the ledgers of his own companies, straight back to a debt he owed this town before he'd ever driven down that dirt road at all. All he knew, staring at that blank page past midnight, was that somewhere out there was a man who had taken everything from Deborah Arnold and let her carry the weight of it alone, and Hanol Chan was done watching from a distance. By morning, the answer to find out who did this to her had a shape, if not yet a name, and Hanol Chan knew exactly where to start looking. A town this small didn't have banks that talked and lawyers that talked. It had garages. It had the place where every truck in the county eventually broke down, where men sat around on overturned buckets waiting on an oil change and let their mouths run loose because nobody important was supposed to be listening. He'd learned that lesson 30 years ago on the docks of Busan before he'd ever learned a single lesson in a boardroom, and some truths didn't change no matter which side of the world you stood on. He found Thompson's Auto Repair on the edge of what passed for downtown, a low cinder block building with 2 bays and a hand-painted sign gone soft at the edges from weather. He drove the G-Wagon in slow, letting it cough a little on purpose before he cut the engine, and he walked in wearing jeans he'd bought that morning at the general store and a plain shirt with the collar buttoned high enough to hide the ink at his throat. A man came out from under a lifted Silverado wiping grease off her hands onto a rag tucked in her back pocket. Not a man at all, he realized, but a broad-shouldered woman somewhere in her 50s, with silver threading through cropped hair and eyes that had already sized him up twice before she said a word. "Help you?" Hattie Thompson asked, in the flat tone of a woman who'd met plenty of strangers passing through and trusted exactly none of them. He told her the engine was making a sound he didn't like. She told him to pop the hood, and while she leaned over the block with a flashlight, Hanol Chan let his eyes drift around the shop the way he used to case a warehouse before a deal, not obviously, just enough to read the room. Faded photographs taped near the register. A calendar 3 years out of date. And on the wall behind the counter, half hidden behind a rack of fan belts, a newspaper clipping gone yellow at the corners, old enough that he had to walk closer to make out the headline before he caught himself and didn't. "You're not from around here," Hattie said, not looking up from the engine. "Business," he said. "Land." She let the flashlight beam travel over a belt, tapped it once, kept working. "Lot of that lately. Sterling's been selling off parcels like the county's a yard sale." The name landed soft, the way a name does when you don't yet know what it's carrying. Hanol Chan kept his voice easy. "Sterling, that the family that runs things out here." Hattie's laugh had no humor in it at all. "Runs things is one way to say it." She straightened up, wiped her hands again, studied him a beat longer than the question warranted. "You said land. You buying near the processing plant?" "Might be." "Then you ought to know what you're buying next to." She said it like a warning, not gossip, and something in the set of her jaw told Hanol Chan this was a woman who had decided a long time ago exactly how much of this story she was willing to tell strangers, and it wasn't much, until it was. He didn't push. He'd learned that pushing closed doors that patients opened on their own, so he let the silence sit there in the shop between the smell of motor oil and the hum of a box fan. And eventually, Hattie set the rag down and leaned back against the workbench like the weight of something had finally tipped past what she could keep balanced alone. 4 years ago, she said, there was a woman worked logistics out at that plant. Good woman. Ran a tight operation, kept the books cleaner than half the men who came after her ever did. Then $120,000 goes missing out of the plant's cash operations, and by the end of that week she's the one sitting in a sheriff's office answering questions nobody bothered asking anybody else. Hattie's mouth pulled tight. Wasn't even a real investigation. Wasn't a trial that meant anything. Old man Sterling owns half the county council and every judge that matters, and once his name got attached to who ought to be blamed, that was the end of it. She never got her day where the truth had a fair shot. Hanel Chan felt something cold settle into his chest, the particular cold of a man who has spent his whole life around men who bought outcomes and recognized the shape of it instantly in someone else's hands. "She have a name?" he asked, careful to keep his voice at exactly the pitch of a curious stranger and nothing more. Hattie looked at him a long moment, and for one heartbeat he thought she saw straight through the collar and the borrowed shirt to the man underneath. Then she looked back at her tools. "Deborah Arnold," she said. "Lost her job, lost her name, lost near everything a person can lose without dying. Raising a little girl out there on nothing but grit." Why, Hanel Chan thought, the question rising up sharp and unanswered even as Hattie kept talking. Why Deborah specifically? Out of every employee at that plant, why did the frame land on her, and who made sure it stuck? It wasn't random. Frame jobs that clean, that fast, that unchallenged, somebody had chosen her on purpose, and he didn't yet know why, but he intended to find out. "Small towns don't hide secrets," Hattie said, almost to herself now, wiping the flashlight down and setting it in its cradle. "They bury them, under cash mostly, under fear the rest of the time." She looked up at him, and something in her face had shifted from suspicion into something closer to tired grief. "Rich men talk around here. Poor folks pay the bill. That's how it's always worked, and I don't expect that's changing on account of one stranger's engine trouble." Hanel Chan stood in that garage with the smell of oil in his throat and understood, with a clarity that felt like a blade going in slow, that he was not looking at a simple case of one bad accusation. He was looking at a system, a whole architecture of quiet power built specifically so that a man like Arthur Sterling never had to raise his voice, never had to dirty his hands, never had to answer to anyone, because the county itself had been arranged to protect him before the accusation was even made. Hanel Chan had spent his life inside systems like that. He had built a few of his own. And for the first time in longer than he wanted to admit, standing in a stranger's garage in the Georgia heat, he felt something close to shame at how easily he recognized the machinery. If what Hattie Thompson had just told him was true, and every instinct honed over 26 years of reading liars for a living told him it was, then Arthur Sterling hadn't just taken Deborah's job. He'd taken her name, her standing, her ability to walk into any office in this county and be believed, and he'd done it with the casual confidence of a man who had never once been made to answer for anything in his life. If you believe a woman deserves better than a system built to bury her before she ever gets a chance to speak, if that kind of quiet, small-town corruption makes your blood run hot the way it just made mine, say so in the comments right now. Tell me her name. Tell me you're standing with Deborah Arnold. Because before this story is over, Arthur Sterling is going to learn exactly what it costs when the wrong stranger starts asking questions in his town. He thanked Hattie for looking at the engine, paid her twice what the diagnostic was worth in cash she tried to wave off, and walked back out into the white glare of the parking lot with one thought sitting louder than every other in his mind. A thought that had nothing to do with revenge yet, and everything to do with a number. $120,000. He knew that figure. Not the amount itself, but the shape of it, the particular size and cleanliness of a sum like that moving through a small operations books. He'd seen numbers exactly like it before, in ledgers that belonged to companies with his own name, buried 3 shell layers deep in the ownership chain, and the coincidence sat in his stomach like a stone dropped down a well he couldn't yet see the bottom of. That number followed him all the way back to the motel, and sat with him through a restless night and a longer morning. But by noon, Hanul Chan had made a decision that had nothing to do with ledgers at all. Whatever Arthur Sterling had done, whatever connection his own companies might have to that $120,000, none of it changed the fact that a woman he had once promised his whole life to was living in a house with a collapsing roof, and he could not sit in a motel room turning over spreadsheets while she carried mattresses down dirt roads. So he left the suits in the closet. He put on plain jeans and a work shirt, left the G-Wagon parked 2 streets over and walked the last stretch on foot. And by the time he reached the end of Deborah's drive, his heart was working harder than it had in any negotiation he could remember. He'd rehearsed it a dozen ways in his head. The land firm he'd registered that morning under a name that meant nothing to anyone in this county, an administrative position with real pay and real benefits, something clean and legitimate she could take without ever knowing where the money underneath it had first come from. It felt, standing there rehearsing it one last time, like the kindest thing a man in his position could offer. It did not occur to him, not fully, not until he was standing at the bottom of her porch steps. That kindness handed down from a stranger with a stranger's money still looked, from where Deborah stood, exactly like charity. She came around the side of the house with a dish towel in her hands, wiping them dry, and stopped so suddenly her whole body seemed to lock in place. The towel slipped from her fingers and hit the packed red dirt like a dropped flag, and for 3 long seconds neither of them said a word, because there was nothing small enough to say first. "Hanul," she said finally, and his name in her mouth after 26 years landed harder than any blow he'd ever taken in his life. "Deborah," he kept his voice low, careful, the way a man approaches something wounded and unpredictable. "I know exactly what this is." Her voice had gone flat and cold, the particular calm of a woman who had spent years learning to keep her fury from spilling out where it could cost her something. "You're standing on my land in a shirt that still has the fold creases from the store, telling me you got some job offer for me. That what this is?" "It's a real position, land management, administrative." "I don't care what it is." Her chin came up, and he watched 26 years of buried grief rearrange itself into something sharper, something with teeth. "You think I don't know what this looks like?" A man disappears on a girl at 18, doesn't call, doesn't write, doesn't send one single word for over 2 decades, and then one day he rolls back into town in a fancy truck and decides the way to fix it is a job offer, like I'm a project you're managing instead of a person you left standing at a bus stop with a promise in my hand and nothing else. Her voice cracked once, hard, right down the middle, and she didn't try to hide it. "You left with a duffel bag, Hanul. Don't come back with a checkbook." He stood there and took it, because he had no right not to. Every accusation landed true, and there was no version of tonight where he got to argue his way out of the truth of what he'd done to her. "I didn't have a choice," he said, and even as the words left him, he heard how thin they sounded against everything she'd survived. "My family." "Everybody's got a family," Deborah said. "Everybody's got a reason. I had a reason too. I had a little girl inside that house who needed feeding, and a job that got stolen out from under me by men who never once had to answer for it, and you know what I did with my reasons. I got up every single morning and I carried what needed carrying. I didn't send a stranger with money to do it for me." She wiped at her eyes fast, angry at herself for the tears more than at him for causing them. "So no. I don't want your job. I don't want your truck sitting at the end of my road. I want you to get back in it and go back to whatever life you built without me, because I built one too, and it's mine." He should have left it there. He knew, even as it happened, that pushing further was its own kind of arrogance. But before he could find a way to leave with any dignity intact, the screen door creaked and Naomi stepped out onto the porch behind her mother, barefoot, one hand still holding a coloring book, the other rising unconsciously to rub at her opposite, wrist the way she always did when something in the air felt uncertain. Hanul Chan's breath caught in his chest. It wasn't only the wrist this time. It was her eyes, catching the afternoon light at an angle he hadn't seen yesterday through the field glasses. A green so pale it edged toward hazel, the exact color his younger brother's eyes had turned in direct sun, the same color that used to make their grandmother swear the boy had been born with a piece of sky trapped inside him. Hanul Chan had not seen those eyes on a living person since the day his brother died. And here they were, looking straight at him out of a 4-year-old's face on a broken-down porch in rural Georgia, and the ground genuinely seemed to tilt beneath his boots. How long has she known, he thought, the question rising up fast and unwelcome even as he stood there frozen. And if she's known this whole time, why didn't she ever try to find me, or did she, and it never reached me at all? "Naomi, baby, go on back inside," Deborah said, quick, protective, stepping half in front of her daughter without seeming to think about it. And something in the sharpness of that movement told Hanul Chan everything he needed to know about how careful this woman had been for 4 straight years, guarding a secret that had apparently been sitting in plain sight the whole time he'd been standing in her yard arguing about a job. He didn't say the word out loud. He didn't have to. Deborah saw exactly where his eyes had gone, saw the shape of the question forming behind them, and her whole face changed. The anger didn't leave, but something else moved in underneath it, something closer to fear. The fear of a woman watching a secret she'd protected with everything she had suddenly step out into the light without her permission. "Deborah," he said, and his voice had lost every bit of the steadiness he'd walked up that drive with. "How old is she?" Deborah Arnold stood on that porch with the dish towel still lying in the red dirt at her feet and said nothing at all. And the silence between them stretched out long enough to hold 26 years and 4 more besides. And if what she owed the town of Sterling County was justice, then what Hanul Chan realized in that silence he owed her was a truth he'd been too much of a coward to ask about until it was standing right in front of him with his brother's eyes. If you believe no amount of money should ever buy a corrupt man his way out of justice, not Sterling, not anybody who's built a fortune off somebody else's suffering, hit that like button right now and let this story know you're standing on Deborah's side of that porch, because what's coming for Arthur Sterling is only just beginning. The silence broke first, not with an answer, but with Deborah bending down slow to pick the dish towel out of the dirt, folding it once over her arm like the motion could buy her a few extra seconds to decide what she owed this man standing in her yard. "You need to leave," she said quietly, and there was no anger left in it now, only a kind of exhausted finality that hit Hanul Chan harder than the shouting had. "Whatever you think you saw. Whatever question is sitting behind your eyes right now, I'm not answering it standing out here in the open where anybody driving past can see us having this conversation. You want to know something about my life. You don't get to just walk up my drive and demand it after 26 years of nothing." He nodded because she was right, and because pushing any further would have cost him whatever thin thread of possibility still existed between them. He left without another word, walked the 2 streets back to where he'd parked, and sat behind the wheel of the G-Wagon for a long time before he trusted his hands enough to drive. By the time he reached the motel, something in him had shifted. It wasn't resignation. It was recalibration, the same cold clarity that had built his fortune in the first place, except now it was aimed somewhere it had never been aimed before, not at a deal, not at an enemy, but at a woman's dignity, which he was beginning to understand was the one currency in this county that couldn't be bought with a checkbook, no matter how large the number written on it. Deborah had made that plain enough on her porch. Money handed to her directly, no matter how kindly meant, would only ever look like mob charity, because that was exactly what it would be. A rich man's guilt dressed up as generosity, offered on his timeline instead of hers. If he wanted to actually help her, he was going to have to get a lot smarter about how invisible he was willing to make himself. So he made calls, not to Deborah, not to anyone in this county at all. He called his land attorney in Atlanta first, and by the end of that call, he had authorized the quiet purchase of nearly 500 acres surrounding the Sterling processing plant, structured through 4 separate holding companies so that no single filing anywhere would ever connect the acreage back to one name. On paper, it would look like nothing more than a logistics firm scouting rural distribution routes, the kind of unremarkable land grab that happened in counties like this one every year without anybody blinking. Underneath it, Hanul Chan intended to build something real, warehouses, a distribution hub, actual jobs with actual paychecks that could exist in this county long after he was gone, jobs that a woman with a ruined reputation might one day be quietly steered toward without ever having to know whose hand had steered her there. Power, he was starting to understand all over again, had never really been about the gun in his hand or the fear in another man's eyes. It was about buying the ground your enemy stood on, patiently, silently, until one day he looked around and realized the whole board had changed under his feet. His second call went to Seoul, to a small, closed circle of forensic accountants his family's operation had used for over a decade to move money in ways that left no fingerprints anywhere official systems could trace. He gave them one task only: pull every public filing connected to Arthur Sterling's processing plant, cross-reference the 4-year-old robbery report against the company's audited statements from that period, and tell him where the math stopped making sense. If $120,000 had truly vanished from that operation the way Hattie described, there would be a paper trail somewhere, however carefully it had been buried. Men like Sterling didn't disappear money without leaving some kind of scar in the books, even if the scar was small enough that nobody looking for the wrong thing would ever notice it. It was 2 days later, while he sat parked on a rise half a mile from the farmhouse with a pair of field glasses resting against his knee, that the encrypted call came through from Seoul. Not the accountants this time, but Yoon T, his second lieutenant, the man who had run operations in his absence for going on 3 weeks now, while Hanel Chan lingered in a rural Georgia motel room chasing a woman from his past. The line crackled with the particular static of a signal, bounced through half a dozen relays to keep it clean. "You're missing negotiations for a ghost, Hanel," Yoon T said. No greeting, no softness in it at all. "The Port Consortium wants an answer on the Busan contracts by Friday. Every day you're not here is a day somebody else starts wondering why the boss vanished off a $100 million deal to sit in some backwater American county." "I know what's at stake," Hanel Chan said quietly. "Do you?" It wasn't a question. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like a man who's forgotten who put a target on his back the last time he let something personal slow him down. There are people in this organization who have been waiting a long time for you to make a mistake big enough to justify moving against you, and right now you're handing them the opening on a plate." Hanel Chan didn't answer that right away. Below him, half a mile down the slope, Deborah had come out onto the porch with a basket of laundry balanced against her hip, and even through the glasses he could see the particular rhythm of her movements. Efficient, unhurried, the motions of a woman who had long since stopped expecting anyone to make her life easier and had built her whole days around not needing them to. She hung a shirt, adjusted it, reached for the next one without looking. There was a kind of exhausted grace in it that he found himself unable to look away from, the same way he hadn't been able to look away 26 years ago, except now the watching felt less like longing and more like penance. What is Yoon T not telling him? He wondered, lowering the glasses slightly, because something in his lieutenant's voice had carried an edge sharper than simple business urgency. An edge that sounded, if he let himself really listen to it, less like frustration and more like a warning being delivered on someone else's behalf. "Buy me 2 more weeks, Hanel Chan said finally. The line went quiet for a beat too long before Yoon T answered. 2 weeks, he repeated, flat. "I'll tell them that. I don't know how many more times I can tell them that before somebody stops asking me and starts asking you directly. Watch yourself, Hanel. Some debts don't wait for permission." The call ended without another word, and Hanel Chan sat there in the truck a long moment with the phone still warm in his hand, the threat sitting under Yoon T's last sentence, settling into his chest like a stone dropped somewhere he couldn't see the bottom of. He had spent 2 decades building an organization ruthless enough that no one questioned his authority twice. He understood, with the particular clarity of a man who had built the very machinery, now potentially turning against him, exactly what it meant when that machinery started asking why the boss had stopped answering calls the way he used to. He raised the glasses again. Deborah had finished the laundry and was crouched now on the bottom porch step. Naomi settled beside her working through the coloring book from the day before, and for a moment the two of them sat together in a patch of shade so ordinary, so unguarded, that it looked almost like peace. He watched the rhythm of it, how Deborah's shoulders had finally dropped from the rigid line they held whenever a stranger was near, how she leaned to point something out in the coloring book and Naomi laughed at whatever she said, And Hanel Chan understood he was witnessing something he had no right to yet, a private hour in a life he had walked away from a lifetime ago. Somewhere behind him, in Seoul, men who had once called him brother were beginning to wonder aloud whether that hour was worth what it might cost him. He didn't look away from the glasses to consider the question. He already knew the answer. And it frightened him more than any threat Yoon-tae could have delivered down that crackling line. The email from Seoul arrived just after 11 that night, flagged priority, and Hanel Chan lowered the field glasses for the last time that evening to open it, expecting nothing more than confirmation of what Hattie had already told him in that garage. A clean theft, a corrupt cover-up, a name he could finally put a face to. What he got instead sat him down hard on the edge of the motel bed with the laptop balanced on his knees, because the numbers scrolling across that encrypted screen didn't just confirm the frame job. They unraveled something far worse. The $120,000 had never actually gone missing from the processing plant's books the way the sheriff's report claimed. It had been moved, quietly, deliberately, in 3-stage transfers over 11 days, into an offshore holding account registered under a shell company with a name so generic it was clearly built to disappear the moment anyone looked too closely. The account belonged to Gabriel Sterling, Arthur's son. A young man, the file noted, with a documented pattern of high-stakes card games running out of private rooms in Savannah and Charleston, games that had a habit of leaving their losers considerably poorer and considerably more desperate than they'd arrived. Gabriel hadn't stolen the money out of greed dressed up as ambition. He'd stolen it because he owed people the kind of debt that didn't accept late payments, and his father's plant had been the easiest till within reach. That much alone would have been enough to bring the whole frame collapsing down around Arthur Sterling's feet. It was the next line in the file that made Hanel Chan's stomach drop straight through the floor. The offshore account Gabriel had used to launder those funds routed 2 transfers downstream through a maritime logistics holding company based out of Busan, a company Hanel Chan had personally run for 6 years before folding it into his broader shipping operation. His signature was on the original incorporation documents, not recently. 3 years ago, back when he'd restructured half a dozen shell entities during an expansion push he barely remembered making now, one deal among hundreds, a stack of papers signed in an afternoon he couldn't have picked out of 100 identical afternoons if his life depended on it. He had never once heard the name Gabriel Sterling. He had never heard of Sterling County, Georgia, until 3 days ago. And yet there it was on the screen in front of him, his own signature, sitting 3 degrees removed from the exact financial mechanism that had taken Deborah Arnold's job, her reputation, and 4 years of her life. He read it twice. Then a third time, slower, hoping the numbers would rearrange themselves into something less damning. They didn't. The particular shell architecture Gabriel had used, the layered accounts, the offshore routing, the deliberately confusing paper trail designed to survive exactly the kind of casual scrutiny a small-town sheriff's department was capable of. That architecture wasn't something a spoiled rich kid with a gambling problem had dreamed up on his own. That was the kind of structure Hanel Chan's own organization had spent years perfecting, and at some point in its expansion, apparently begun quietly leasing out. As a service, laundering money for clients his lieutenants vetted, clients Hanel Chan himself had never personally reviewed, because by then he'd trusted his own machine enough to stop checking every gear. Somewhere in that machine, Gabriel Sterling had found a door. And Hanel Chan's empire, the very engine he'd built to escape the poverty and helplessness of his own boyhood, had opened it for him without ever knowing or caring, whose life would be crushed underneath it on the other end. He sat with that for a long time, the laptop's glow the only light in the room, and something in his chest that had been steady for 20 years, that had survived faction wars and betrayals, and the deaths of men he'd once called brothers, finally cracked all the way open. He had told himself, walking up Deborah's drive with that job offer folded neatly in his mind, that he was a man trying to make right on an old broken promise. He understood now that the truth was crueler and far less noble than that. He hadn't just failed her 26 years ago and left her to survive alone. His own empire, the wealth, the shell companies, the systems he'd built with such pride, Systems he'd once believed made him untouchable had reached across an ocean and a continent, and without ever knowing her name, helped destroy the one woman he had never stopped loving. How many other Debras were out there? The thought rose up unwanted, sharp enough that he had to set the laptop down and press the heels of his hands against his eyes. How many other lives had his systems quietly ruined in places he'd never bothered to look, while he sat in boardrooms congratulating himself on how clean his hands stayed? It was a question he didn't have an answer to yet, and one he understood with a kind of sick clarity that he might spend the rest of his life trying to answer. He thought of her on that porch step that afternoon, laughing quietly at something in a coloring book, believing, as far as she knew, that the man who'd ruined her life was some faceless plant on her 2 counties over. She had no idea the real monster in her story had his face stamped somewhere on its foundation, buried 3 shell layers deep in paperwork he'd signed without a second thought. He had spent 4 days telling himself he was the one riding in to save her. Sitting in that motel room past midnight, Hanel Chan understood for the first time that he might also be, in some indirect and inescapable way, the reason she'd needed saving at all. He didn't sleep that night either, but the sleeplessness had changed shape. It wasn't grief pulling at him anymore, or longing, or even guilt in its purest form. It sharpened, slowly, into something closer to resolve, the particular cold clarity he'd once used to close deals worth more than small nations, except now aimed entirely at unmaking what his own hands had helped build. If his empire had opened the door that let Gabriel Sterling steal $120,000 and bury an innocent woman's name under it, then Hanel Chan intended to be the one who walked back through that same door and tore the whole structure down from the inside. Not with threats, not with the violence his family name still carried in certain rooms, but with the same paper trail that had convicted her, turned now against the men who'd built it. He knew, sitting there in the dark with the laptop's glow fading to sleep mode beside him, that there was no version of this where he could tell Deborah the full truth without risking everything, without her looking at him not as a man trying to make amends, but as the very source of the machinery that broke her. And yet he also knew, with the same certainty that had once told him exactly which men in a room were lying, that he could not undo what his empire had done to her while hiding what his empire was. Somewhere between those 2 truths sat a decision he wasn't ready to make yet, and it terrified him more than any threat Yunti had delivered down that crackling line from Seoul. If you've made it this far with Hanel Chan tonight, I want to hear from you honestly, the way only a woman who's lived a real life can answer this. 26 years of silence, an empire that unknowingly helped ruin the very woman he loved, and now a truth he's terrified to tell her. Would you have forgiven him? Drop your honest answer in the comments below, because I promise you, this story is only getting started, and I want to know where your heart stands before we find out where Deborah's does. And if a story like this one is sitting heavy on you right now, if you find yourself thinking about every woman who's ever carried a burden alone, while somebody else's carelessness quietly worked against her from a distance, I want you to know Deborah's story isn't the only one waiting for you tonight. There's 2 other stories in our founding member collection, different women, different fights, but the same kind of hard-won grace, discounted for a limited time with a free audiobook included, so her voice can keep you company on the nights when you need it most. The link is right there in the description and pinned at the top of the comments. Watching on your television tonight. No trouble at all, grab your phone, open your camera, hold it steady over the QR code on your screen, and it'll carry you straight there. Buying her story isn't a pause in this one. It's you saying, out loud, that every woman who fought this hard deserves to have her story told and bought and believed. That decision was still sitting unmade 3 nights later when the sky over Sterling County split open and made the choice feel, for 1 terrifying hour, like it didn't matter at all. The storm rolled in fast, the way summer storms did in that part of Georgia, no warning beyond a sudden green tint to the light and a wind that turned the pines sideways. Hanel Chan was in his motel room when the first hard sheet of rain hit the window, and something in him, some old instinct sharpened over years of watching weather reports for shipping lanes, told him this one wasn't going to pass through easy. He drove out toward the farmhouse without fully deciding to, telling himself it was only to check the road conditions, knowing even as he told himself that lie that it wasn't true at all. He was still half a mile out when he saw it, a section of the old tin roof peeling back under the wind like a scab torn loose, metal shrieking as it folded. And even through the rain hammering his windshield he could hear, or thought he could hear, a child screaming somewhere inside that house. He didn't remember parking. He didn't remember crossing the yard. He remembered only the door giving under his shoulder, and the sight of Deborah standing in the front room with Naomi clutched hard against her chest. Both of them soaked through, water pouring down through a jagged gap in the ceiling and pooling fast across the floorboards, the whole structure groaning overhead like it might give way entirely. "Get her to the truck," he said, already moving, already hauling the couch away from beneath the widening gap. "Now, both of you now." There was no argument in Deborah that night. Whatever pride had stood between them on that porch, a week ago dissolved instantly in the face of her daughter's safety, and she got Naomi wrapped in a blanket and into the back of his truck, while Hanul Chan worked the phone with one hand and dragged furniture clear of the leak with the other, calling every number his lawyers had on file for licensed contractors within 50 miles who could be convinced, with enough money and enough urgency, to send a crew out in the middle of a storm. They came within the hour, 4 men in rain gear with tarps and lumber, moving fast and professional, the kind of crew that didn't ask questions about why a stranger was paying triple rate for emergency work on a house that wasn't his. Hanul Chan had already anticipated the question that would come once the immediate danger passed. The question of how a man Deborah had told to leave her property a week ago was suddenly standing in her yard commanding a repair crew like he owned the place, and he'd built the answer before he ever needed it. His lawyers had, 2 days earlier, quietly established a legal child support escrow account in Naomi's name, structured through the county court system with paperwork clean enough to survive any scrutiny, the kind of arrangement that existed specifically so that a biological father could contribute to a child's welfare without it ever looking or functioning like charity to the mother. Tonight's repairs would route through that fund. Official. Documented. Owed to Naomi, not given to Deborah. By the time the worst of the storm passed, and the crew had the roof sealed under heavy tarp for the night, promising a full repair crew back at first light, the house had gone from crisis to merely cold and damp, and Deborah sat at her kitchen table wrapped in a dry blanket with Naomi finally asleep on the couch nearby, worn out from fear more than the hour was late. Hanul Chan stood near the door, unsure if he was meant to stay or go, until Deborah looked up at him with an exhaustion too deep to carry any more anger in it and said quietly, "Sit down, Hanul. You're dripping on my floor." He sat. She made coffee on a stove that flickered under the strain of the storm's aftermath, and they sat together in the candlelight because the power had gone out somewhere down the line, 2 cups steaming between them, and for a long while neither of them said anything at all. It was Deborah who finally broke it. "I want you to know something," she said, staring into her cup rather than at him, "and I need you to just let me say it without arguing with me about it because I've carried it a long time and I'm tired of carrying it alone." She took a breath. "4 years ago, after that week you came back, I tried to find you." Hanul Chan went very still. "I didn't have an address," she went on. "Didn't have anything but an old business card you'd left with me years before, some shipping office number in Savannah. I called it. Got transferred twice, and the 3rd time the woman on the line told me there was no record of a Hanul Chan ever working there, no forwarding number, nothing. I thought maybe I'd written it down wrong, so I tried again a different day. Same thing. I called 5 different numbers over that year. Hanul, everyone I could dig up connected to you, and every single operator told me the same thing. You didn't exist. Like somebody had reached in and erased you clean off the record before I ever got the chance to say the words I needed to say." Her voice caught, but she pushed through it, because she'd clearly decided a long time ago she would say this if she ever got the chance, and she wasn't going to let herself lose her nerve now. "I want you to know I tried. Before you go thinking I raised that baby alone by choice, out of spite, keeping her from you on purpose, I want you to know I tried, and the world you belonged to made real sure I couldn't reach you." If Deborah had reached him then, Hanul Chan thought, the realization settling into him with the weight of a stone, what would his family have done to keep that call from ever finding him? And how many other calls, other letters, other people trying to find him over the years, had simply vanished the same way, erased by hands he'd never bothered to question. He sat with that a long moment, the candle flickering low between them, and found that for the first time in longer than he could remember, longer, certainly, than any negotiation, any standoff, any moment where the wrong word could have cost him his life, he had absolutely no words at all. 20 years of running an empire built on always having an answer, always having the next move ready before the other man finished speaking. And here, in a dim kitchen with rain still ticking off the tarp overhead, Hanul Chan simply sat in silence, because nothing he could say would undo what his own world had done to her without his knowledge or his permission. "I'm sorry," he finally managed, and it came out rougher than he intended, rougher than anything he'd said since he arrived in this county. "I'm sorry doesn't fix 4 years, I know that, but I need you to hear it anyway. I didn't know. I swear to you, Deborah, I didn't know you tried." Deborah looked at him across the candlelight, something in her face softening in a way it hadn't since that day on the porch. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but the first small crack of a door that had been sealed shut for 26 years. "I believe you," she said quietly. "That's the strange part. I sat here hatting you for 4 years, and now you're sitting in my kitchen after pulling my daughter out of a collapsing roof, and I believe every word you just said." She wrapped both hands around her cup like she needed something warm to hold on to. "Doesn't mean I know what to do with that. Doesn't mean any of this is simple, but I believe you." Outside, the rain had softened to something gentler, tapping steady against the tarp instead of hammering it, and in that small, quiet kitchen lit by one candle, Hanul Chan understood that something between them had shifted tonight, not fixed, not finished, but shifted, the way ground shifts before something long buried finally starts to surface. He didn't know yet what he would do with the truth still sitting unspoken in his chest. The truth about ledgers and shell companies, and a signature 3 years old that connected his own hands to the wreckage of her life. But sitting across from her in that candlelight, watching her finally let her guard down enough to hold a coffee cup instead of a weapon, he knew one thing with complete certainty. Whatever it cost him, he was not leaving this county again without making this right, all the way down to the roots of it, no matter how deep those roots turned out to run. That resolve was still fresh in him 3 days later when word reached him. Through a source inside the county clerk's office, his lawyers had quietly retained that someone had filed a formal request to reopen the 4-year-old robbery inquiry, his own forensic audit, moving now through legitimate legal channels exactly as he'd planned, and apparently moving faster than anyone in the Sterling family had expected. He wasn't surprised, an hour after that news reached him. When a black pickup with county plates rolled up the gravel drive of the ranch office he'd set up on his newly purchased acreage, or when Gabriel Sterling climbed out of it, flanked by 2 men who carried themselves like hired muscle instead of hired hands. Gabriel walked into that office like he still believed his father's name opened every door in the county without question, and for a moment, watching him cross the threshold with that particular loose, entitled swagger of a man who had never once faced real consequences, Hanul Chan almost felt something close to pity for him. Almost. "Heard you've been busy," Gabriel said, dropping into the chair across from the desk without being asked, one of his men taking up a position by the door while the other lingered near the window, hand resting a little too deliberately near his jacket. "Buying up land, asking questions at Hattie's shop, paying court clerks to dig up old paperwork that everybody in this county agreed a long time ago was settled." He smiled, and it was the practiced, oily smile of a man who'd spent his whole life being told his charm was a substitute for character. "My father sent me to be neighborly, offer you a deal." "I'm listening," Hanul Chan said, and kept his hands folded calmly on the desk, his voice carrying none of the tension coiling quietly through the rest of him. "Drop the audit," Gabriel said. "Whatever you think you found, whatever old grudge you're carrying against my family, walk away from it, and my father guarantees your land deal sails through the county council without a single objection. Permits, zoning, water rights, all of it clean and fast, no delays, no red tape. That's a lot of money we're saving you. Time is money, right? Even for a man who apparently has plenty of both." He thinks this is about the land deal, Hanul Chan realized, with a flicker of something almost like disbelief. He genuinely doesn't understand yet that this was never about the land at all. And if I don't, Hanel-chan said quietly, drop the audit. Gabriel's smile thinned. Then you'll find business in this county gets a lot harder for you than you're used to. My father knows people, judges, inspectors, men who can make a 500-acre development sit tied up in permitting hell for the next decade if he wants it to. He leaned forward slightly, and the man by the window shifted his weight in a way meant to be seen. This is a small town, friend. Outsiders who don't learn how things work around here don't tend to last long. Hanel-chan let the threat sit in the room a moment, unhurried, and then he did something Gabriel clearly wasn't prepared for. He laughed, low and quiet, the kind of laugh that had made grown men in Seoul boardrooms go pale, because they understood exactly what it meant when Hanel-chan found something genuinely, dangerously amusing. You brought 2 men and a threat about permits into a room with me, Hanel-chan said, standing slowly, and you think that's leverage. He came around the desk without any particular urgency, and the man near the window straightened fully, hand moving toward his jacket, and that was the last mistake anyone in that room made that afternoon. Hanel-chan closed the distance before the man's fingers found whatever he was reaching for, caught his wrist, and turned it hard enough to drop him to one knee with a short, controlled cry, disarmed him of the pistol tucked at his hip in the same motion, and had the second guard's arm pinned behind his back against the wall before Gabriel had even fully risen out of his chair. It happened in under 4 seconds, silent except for the 2 men's pained breathing, no shot fired, no furniture broken, nothing but the plain and terrible efficiency of a man who had learned this particular trade long before he'd ever learned to run a company. Gabriel stood frozen, all his practiced swagger gone white off his face, staring at a man who had just proven, without raising his voice once, that he had brought hired muscle into a room with someone who had survived things Gabriel Sterling couldn't begin to imagine. Hanel-chan set the confiscated pistol down on the desk, unhurried, and walked up close enough that Gabriel had to fight the instinct to step back. Tell your father, he said, low, almost gentle, right into Gabriel's ear, that dirt roads run both ways. He straightened, studying the younger man's face the way a predator studies something it has already decided is prey. You came here thinking you were delivering a threat. What you actually delivered was confirmation. A man who sends armed muscle to intimidate a stranger over an audit isn't a man defending his family's reputation. He's a man protecting a crime. He nodded toward the door. Get out of my office. Take your men. And you should know, the woman you helped ruin 4 years ago has more friends than your father realizes, and every single one of them is about to find out exactly what you and your daddy did to her. Gabriel didn't say another word. He gathered his shaken men and left without the swagger he'd arrived with, and Hanel-chan stood alone in the doorway watching the truck kick up dust down the drive, feeling something settle in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time, not triumph exactly, but a cold, clean satisfaction. The particular pleasure of a man who has just watched a bully discover, in real time, that the ground beneath him was no longer as solid as he'd believed. If you love watching small-town tyrants get exactly what's coming to them, hit that subscribe button right now, because Arthur Sterling has no idea yet what just walked out of that office to report back to him. That satisfaction lasted exactly as long as it took Gabriel to reach his father's estate. Arthur Sterling listened to his son's account of the meeting without interrupting once, his face gone stone still behind his desk, in a study lined with hunting trophies and framed photographs of a county he'd governed like his personal kingdom for 3 decades. And when Gabriel finished, breathless and humiliated, Arthur said nothing for a long, long moment. He put his hands on my men, Arthur finally said, quiet, almost thoughtful, the ivory head of his cane tapping once against the floor. In my county. Father, we should call the sheriff, we should. The sheriff answers to me, Gabriel, not the other way around, and calling him in on this only makes it official. Arthur rose slowly from his chair, moved to the window overlooking acres of land that had belonged to his family for 4 generations, and stood there a long while with his back to his son. No, this isn't a matter for the law anymore. This man is dangerous, well-funded, and apparently trained in ways that should concern us both. He turned, and something had shifted behind those cold, pale eyes, something final and without mercy. I know men. Men who don't ask questions, who don't leave paperwork, who understand that some problems in this county have always been handled quietly, the old way, long before either of us were born. He picked up the phone on his desk, dialing a number from memory, his voice dropping to something low and businesslike as it connected. "This is Sterling," he said into the receiver. "I have a problem that needs to disappear, quietly, before the week is out." Gabriel stood frozen in the doorway, watching his father arrange, with the same casual authority he'd used to order a fence repaired. The death of a man Gabriel himself had underestimated only hours before, and somewhere on the other side of the county, unaware that his name had just been marked for removal by men who specialized in making problems vanish without a trace. Hanul Chan sat back down at his desk, already turning his attention toward the next piece of the audit. With no idea at all that the ground beneath his own feet had just gone far more dangerous than any boardroom war he'd ever survived. The call that saved his life came, of all places, from Hattie Thompson, who phoned Hanul Chan's ranch office 2 mornings later with a voice tight enough to cut glass, and told him only that he needed to get to her garage after closing, alone, and that he shouldn't tell a single soul in this county where he was headed. He didn't know yet what waited for him there, but something in Hattie's tone, the same woman who'd once looked at him like a stranger and nothing more, told him this wasn't a trap. It was the opposite. It was the first sign that word had started spreading through the quiet channels of this county that somebody was finally willing to stand against the Sterlings, and that willingness had apparently reached further than he'd dared hope. He arrived after dark, the shop's bay doors pulled down and locked, only a single work light burning over the counter. Deborah was already there when he stepped inside, arms crossed, her face unreadable in the dim light. And beside her stood a woman Hanul Chan had never met, younger than Deborah, fine-boned, dressed in clothes too expensive for this garage, with a bruise fatting yellow-green along one cheekbone that she'd tried and failed to fully cover with makeup. Her eyes carried the particular exhausted alertness of someone who had spent years learning to read a room for danger before she ever let herself breathe easy in it. "This is Seela," Hattie said, locking the door behind him. "Seela Sterling." Hanul Chan went very still. "Gabriel's wife." "His estranged wife," Seela corrected, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "As of about 6 months ago, though nobody outside this room knows that yet, and it needs to stay that way a while longer, for my children's sake." She reached into a canvas bag at her feet and drew out a black leather ledger, worn soft at the corners from handling, and set it on the workbench between them with a care that suggested she'd protected that book at real cost to herself. "I've been documenting Gabriel's finances for 2 years. His gambling, the offshore accounts. I started keeping records the first time he came home and put his hands on me over money I didn't even know he'd lost, because I understood, even then, that a man like that would eventually need somebody to blame besides himself." Her hands stayed bruised and steady on the cover of the ledger as she pushed it toward Deborah. "Everything's in here. The dates money moved through the shell account. The instructions Gabriel gave his father's plant manager to falsify the withdrawal records. Your name, written in his own hand, chosen specifically because you were the easiest employee to discredit and the least likely to have the resources to fight back." Deborah's hands trembled as she opened the ledger, flipping through pages of dates and figures in Gabriel Sterling's own handwriting, 4 years of stolen reputation laid out in black ink. And Hanul Chan watched something shift across her face, not just vindication, but a kind of grief for the version of herself who had spent those 4 years believing, some nights, that maybe the county had been right about her, that maybe there'd been something in her they'd all simply seen more clearly than she could see in herself. "Why now?" Deborah asked quietly, looking up at Seela. "You could have handed this to a lawyer, gone through channels that didn't put you in a garage after dark risking your own safety." "Because Arthur Sterling controls every channel in this county," Seela said. "Judges, sheriffs, half the county council owes him something. If I'd gone through official channels, this ledger would have vanished before it ever reached a courtroom, and I would have vanished right along with it." Her composure cracked for just a moment, real fear showing through. "Gabriel found out I'd been keeping records. 2 nights ago. That's when this happened." She touched the fatting bruise without flinching, the gesture of a woman long past being ashamed of what had been done to her. "I'm not doing this for revenge. though God knows I've earned the right to want some. I'm doing this because I have 2 children, and I will not raise them in a house built on what that family did to you, and to God knows how many others before you. What else has Arthur Sterling buried in this county over the years? Hanel Chan found himself wondering, watching Sela's steady, bruised hands, and how many more women like Deborah never got a Sela brave enough to hand over the proof. Hattie crossed her arms, watching all 3 of them with the weight of a woman who had lived in this county her whole life and understood better than anyone what it would cost to move against the Sterlings openly. "You take this to court," she said to Deborah, low and serious. "There's no quiet way through it anymore. Sterling's going to fight this in the open once he realizes what's coming. He's going to try to buy you off first. Mark my words. Offer you money to make it disappear before it ever reaches a judge's desk." She wasn't wrong. Word must have traveled faster than any of them expected, because 2 days later Arthur Sterling's personal attorney arrived unannounced at Deborah's farmhouse with a folder and a check already written, offering a quiet settlement. A substantial sum, generous by any measure, in exchange for Deborah's signature on an agreement that would keep the matter permanently out of any courtroom. No admission of wrongdoing required, no public record, nothing but the money and her silence. Deborah stood on that same porch where she'd once told Hanel Chan to leave with his checkbook, and she looked at that folder of money the way a woman looks at an insult dressed up as a kindness. "Take his money," she said, and her voice carried the full weight of 4 years spent scraping by on nothing while the man who'd stolen from her drove new trucks and slept easy every night. "I don't want his money. I want my name back on every single tongue that dragged it through the dirt. I want every person in this county who looked at me different, who wouldn't hire me, who let their kids treat mine different because they thought I raised a thief. I want every one of them standing in that courtroom when the truth comes out, and I want Arthur Sterling sitting right there watching it happen." She pushed the folder back across the porch rail, unopened. "Tell him no. Tell him I'll see him in court." The attorney left with his check unclaimed, and word of Deborah's refusal moved through the county faster than any of them anticipated, because a woman standing up publicly against Arthur Sterling was something Sterling County hadn't witnessed in longer than most residents could remember, and it did something to the air of the place. A stirring, quiet but unmistakable, of people who had spent years watching Sterling's power operate unchecked beginning to wonder, for the first time, whether that power might finally have found its limit. Arthur Sterling received the news of Deborah's refusal in his study, standing at the same window he'd stood at 2 nights before, and this time there was no calm in his face at all, only the cold fury of a man who had never once, in 3 decades of running this county, been told no by anyone he considered beneath him. He set down the phone slowly, understanding now that the trap he'd hoped would end quietly, discreetly, the old way, had instead just turned fully into the open, and somewhere beneath his fury sat something closer to fear, because a man like Hanel Chan, patient, funded, and apparently untouchable by the usual local pressures, combined with a woman like Deborah Arnold who had just refused every dollar he'd offered, meant that Arthur Sterling's carefully built empire was no longer facing a problem he could bury. It was facing a trial. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Arthur Sterling did not know exactly how this ended. Did Arthur Sterling deserve mercy when his empire finally started to fall? Or did he forfeit every ounce of it the moment he chose to threaten a woman's life instead of facing the truth? Tell us where you stand in the comments below, because this county is about to find out exactly what happens when the people it tried to silence finally decide to speak. The morning of the trial, Sterling County Courthouse filled up faster than anyone at the sheriff's office could remember. Folding chairs dragged in from the fellowship hall next door to line the back wall, and by 9 o'clock people were standing in the hallway just to hear through the open doors, because word had traveled the way it only travels in a small town. Quiet, then all at once. Until everybody who'd ever passed judgment on Deborah Arnold in a grocery store aisle or a church pew wanted to be sitting in that room when the truth finally got said out loud. Deborah sat at the plaintiff's table in a navy dress she'd pressed the night before with an iron that barely held heat anymore, her hands folded tight in her lap. Naomi tucked safely 2 counties away at Hattie's sister's house, because nobody in that courtroom wanted a 4-year-old anywhere near what might happen today. Hanul Chan sat 2 rows back, close enough to watch, far enough to let this be Deborah's moment and not his. He'd promised her that much on the porch 3 nights before, that whatever happened today, the world would see her stand on her own 2 feet and clear her own name, because that was the one thing Arthur Sterling had never let her have, and Hanul Chan was done taking things from her, even good things, without asking first. The forensic accountant from Seoul took the stand first, a soft-spoken man named Dr. An who walked the courtroom through the shell accounts and the stage transfers with the patience of a schoolteacher, laying out on a projector screen the exact path that $120,000 had traveled, out of the plant's operating account, through 2 offshore shells, and straight into a private account that traced back, 3 steps removed, to Gabriel Sterling's own gambling debts in Savannah. A murmur moved through the gallery, low and disbelieving, the sound of a room full of people realizing they'd believed a lie for 4 years because a powerful man had told it to them with enough confidence. Then Selah Sterling took the stand, and the room went dead silent. She'd worn long sleeves despite the August heat, and Hanul Chan understood why the moment she lifted her chin and started speaking. She wanted every eye on her face, not on what her husband had left on her arms. She read from the ledger in a voice that shook at first and steadied as she went, page after page of Gabriel's own handwriting, the instructions he'd given the plant manager, the specific reason he'd chosen Deborah Quiet, no family in town to fight for her, easiest name to bury. When the defense attorney tried to challenge the ledger's authenticity, Selah looked him dead in the eye and said she'd notarized copies with an attorney in Savannah 18 months ago, anticipating exactly this moment, and the attorney sat back down without another question, because there was nothing left to ask. Arthur Sterling sat at the defense table through all of it with his hands folded on the ivory head of his cane, and Hanul Chan watched something in the old man's face go from stone to something closer to a held breath, the look of a man watching the ground open beneath a house he'd spent 30 years believing was built on rock. What none of them in that courtroom knew yet, what sat coiled somewhere outside those doors while Selah testified, was whether Arthur Sterling had truly called off the men he'd summoned to his study 4 nights ago, or whether a call like that, once made, could even be called back at all. It was during the recess, while the judge stepped out and the room stretched and murmured and reached for water, that Hanul Chan felt it, the particular stillness that used to move through a room right before violence, a stillness he'd learned to read on docks in Busan long before he ever learned to read a boardroom. He was moving toward the doors before he'd fully decided to, some old instinct pulling him past Deborah's chair, past the bailiff, out into the bright noon heat of the courthouse steps, and that was where he saw them. 3 men spread loose across the base of the stairs in a formation that had nothing to do with waiting for a bus, one hand resting too casually inside a jacket that was too heavy for the weather. "Get back inside," Hanul Chan said, low, not turning around because he'd heard Deborah's footsteps behind him, felt her stop cold at the top of the steps with a sound caught in her throat. The nearest man moved first, the jacket coming open, and Hanul Chan didn't wait to see what was under it. He closed the distance in 3 strides and drove his shoulder into the man's ribs before the weapon ever cleared leather, and the 2 of them went down hard onto the concrete, and somewhere above him, he heard Deborah scream his name and Naomi wasn't even here. Thank God Naomi wasn't here. And that thought was the only thing that gave him the half-second of clarity he needed to twist the gun free and send it skidding across the steps before the second man reached him. The sheriff's deputies were already moving by then, drawn by the scream and the scrape of bodies on stone. But it was Hanul Chan who put himself between the 3rd man's raised arm and the top of the stairs where Deborah stood frozen, his own body angled square into the line of fire. No calculation in it at all. Nothing but the plain animal certainty that whatever came next was going to have to come through him first. The deputy's shout cracked across the plaza a half-second before the shot did, and the 3rd man went down with a bullet in his shoulder instead of one leaving his gun. And then it was over. That fast. That ordinary and that terrible. 3 men zip-tied on courthouse steps in front of 40 witnesses who'd come to watch a trial, and instead watched a small-town tyrant's last desperate play collapse in real time under the noon sun. Deborah came down those steps at a run, hands shaking as she checked Hanal Chan's arms, his chest, his face, and he let her, because he understood she needed to see with her own eyes that he was whole, and for one unguarded moment neither of them said a single word about what any of it meant. The rest of the trial happened fast after that, the way a dam breaks fast once the first crack finally gives. Arthur Sterling was taken into custody before the afternoon session even reconvened, charged alongside his son with fraud, obstruction, and conspiracy to commit assault. Once the deputies traced the hired men's payment straight back to a Sterling account, nobody had bothered to hide well enough anymore, because Arthur had never once in 30 years imagined he'd need to. Gabriel didn't even wait for the cuffs. He simply put his head down on the defense table and stayed there while the judge read the charges, the swagger gone out of him completely, a boy finally facing the first real consequence of his whole spoiled life. And when the judge finally turned to Deborah Arnold, standing straight-backed at the plaintiff's table in her pressed navy dress with her hands no longer shaking, and read the words "not guilty," all charges dismissed, full restitution ordered. The sound that came out of that courtroom wasn't applause, not at first. It was something quieter and heavier, 40 people who'd spent 4 years believing a lie finally letting it go all at once, and Deborah stood there with her eyes shut, and her chin lifted toward the ceiling like a woman finally setting down a weight she'd carried so long she'd forgotten what her shoulders felt like without it. She didn't look for Hanal Chan first. She looked toward the back doors, toward the county beyond them, toward the little house with the tarp still stretched across its roof, and something crossed her face that looked less like triumph and more like grief for every single day she hadn't gotten to feel this. And it was only then, turning back into the room, that her eyes finally found his and held. If you believe a woman's name is worth fighting for even when the whole world's already decided against her, share this with somebody who needs to remember what real strength looks like. Because Deborah Arnold just got her name back, and Sterling County will never be the same. Their eyes held there in that courtroom for a long moment before Deborah crossed the floor and simply put her hand in his. And that was the whole answer. No speech needed. 40 witnesses watching a woman choose her own ending in front of the county that had tried to write a different one for her. The weeks that followed moved with the strange, almost unbelievable speed of a life finally allowed to right itself. Arthur Sterling's assets went into receivership before the month was out. The processing plant and the land holdings and the quiet grip he'd held on judges and inspectors for 30 years dismantled piece by a state investigation that Sela's ledger had set in motion and couldn't be stopped now that it was moving. Gabriel took a plea that kept him out of the worst of it in exchange for testimony against his father, which told Hanal Chan everything he needed to know about the kind of loyalty that Empire had actually been built on. And Arthur himself, who had spent 3 decades never once being told no, sat in a county holding cell waiting on a trial date, an old man discovering all at once how small a kingdom becomes once the fear holding it together is gone. Hanal Chan's own reckoning came quieter, but it came complete. He flew to Seoul one final time, not as a man running from anything, but as a man closing a door with his own hands. He sat across from Yoon Tae and the small circle of men who had run his organization's darker corners for years, and he told them plainly that every syndicate contract bearing his name would be sold, dissolved, or handed over to men willing to run it without him, effective immediately, and that the shipping company built clean on top of it would be the only thing left standing with his signature on it. There was a long silence in that room, the kind that used to mean danger, and for a moment Hanal Chan understood he might not walk out of it. But Yoon Tae, who had delivered every warning down that crackling phone line for weeks, finally just nodded and said he'd wondered how long it would take Hanal Chan to remember he'd built an empire to escape a poor man's helplessness, not to become another version of the men who'd once held power over him. It wasn't friendship exactly what passed between them in that room, but it was respect, and it was enough to let him leave for good. What none of them said out loud, not Yoon Tae, not Hanal Chan himself, was whether an empire like that ever truly let a man go clean, or whether some piece of it would come looking for him again someday, years down the road, the way old debts sometimes do. He came home to Georgia with nothing but the truck and a folder of dissolved paperwork, and he spent that money the way he'd told himself he would from that very first night in the motel, not on himself, but on the ground under Sterling County's feet. The farmhouse got a real roof first, then a real foundation, then rooms added on slow, and careful the way a family grows into a house rather than a house being built around a family all at once. The 500 acres he'd bought under 4 shell companies became, openly now, under his own name, a distribution hub that brought real jobs to a county that hadn't seen new work in a generation. Jobs that went first and quietly to the families who'd stood by Deborah when standing by her cost something. They married on a Saturday morning in October, when the Georgia heat had finally broken into something gentler, on the porch that no longer sagged, under a sky so clear Hattie said later she'd never seen one like it in 50 years of living in that county. There was no cathedral, no photographers flown in from anywhere, just folding chairs in the yard and a preacher Deborah had known her whole life, and a spread of food that half the county had shown up carrying, because a town that had once let her carry every burden alone had finally learned what it meant to show up. Naomi walked the rings down the aisle on a small velvet pillow, barefoot in the grass the way she liked best, and when she reached her mother, she looked up at Hannel Chan with those pale green eyes and rubbed her wrist once, absently, the old habit, before breaking into a grin that had nothing guarded in it at all. The first truly weightless smile Hannel Chan had seen on her since the day he'd watched her through a pair of field glasses from half a mile away, a stranger to his own child. Deborah said her vows looking straight at him, no hesitation left in her voice at all, and when she got to the part about 26 years and the man who'd finally come back and stayed, there wasn't a dry eye anywhere in that yard, Hattie included, and Hattie would tell anyone who asked that she hadn't cried at a wedding since her own. That evening, after the folding chairs had been cleared and the last of the county had driven off down the dirt road waving out their windows, Hannel Chan sat on the porch steps with Deborah's head resting against his shoulder and Naomi asleep already in the room that used to leak rain. And he understood, watching the last light go gold and then gray over the fields he now owned honestly, for the first time in his life, that this was what all of it had been for, not the empire, not the power. Not even the justice finally served on a man who'd earned every bit of it, but this, a porch, a woman who'd chosen to believe him, a little girl with his brother's eyes sleeping safe under a roof that wouldn't fall down on her again. If Deborah Arnold's story reminded you that the woman who keeps getting back up always gets her flowers eventually, I want you to give yourself the gift of finishing this journey the way it deserves to be finished. Deborah's full story, along with a second novel that will heal every place this one broke you, is waiting in our founding member edition, complete with a free audiobook so her voice can sit with you a while longer. Subscribe now so you never miss a story of vindication and redemption like this one, and go get her book. She earned it. So did you.